every time he came back stronger. With stories of how he built a fire from damp wood or found water from a stream hidden deep between the rocks. As he grew older, this love didn't fade, it only intensified. He began studying survival books, watching others who lived off the land, and practicing every skill he could. While most people carried camping gear like portable stoves, sleeping bags, and tents, he challenged himself to go without. Built shelters from branches and leaves, turning them into places so sturdy that they could withstand storms. He made fire by striking rocks together, using nothing but patience and determination. He purified water through methods people today would consider ancient, letting it drip through layers of sand and charcoal, or boiling it in containers he shaped from the environment itself. People who hiked with him said it was like walking with someone who could read the land as if it were a book. He would pause in front of a tree, place his hand against the bark, and explain what it could be used for, whether it was food, medicine, or shelter. He would stop at the sound of a bird's call and know exactly which direction they should head, because birds often gave away the locations of rivers or open spaces. To him, the forest wasn't a maze, it was a map, and he was fluent in its language. What made him different wasn't just his knowledge, but the calmness he carried with him. For most people, the idea of being stranded in the wilderness sparks fear. Every crack of a branch feels like a predator, every shadow feels like danger. was just beginning to fade. And the forests of the Ozarks were waking back to life. He packed a small bag and announced that he was heading out again. To most people, a trip into the wilderness would mean tents, sleeping bags, food supplies, and a plan for every day. But for him, it was different. His gear was shockingly light. A sturdy backpack, a knife that had been with him for years, and a journal. That was all he carried. To anyone else, it would have seemed reckless. To him, it was freedom. Didn't want to be weighed down by modern tools or comforts. He wanted to meet the forest on its own terms, relying on his skill and willpower instead of manufactured safety. He told his family he planned to document new trails, test his endurance, and live completely off the land. They were used to hearing this. He had done it before many times, in fact. He had come back from storms, from weeks of isolation, from injuries that would have broken another man. Every time, he returned with stories, a tired but proud smile, and a few more pages filled in his weathered journal. This time felt no different. He assured them he would be fine, that he would check in when he could, and that they had nothing to worry about. And though their hearts clenched with worry every time he left, they let him go. After all, this was who he was. The first days passed uneventfully. He moved through the woods the way only he could, confident, alert, reading the signs of nature. Birds told him where rivers flowed, and branches whispered where deer had passed. He marked down observations in his journal, noting the terrain, the weather, the changes in the land. To him, this wasn't just a challenge. It was a conversation with the wilderness. He felt alive out there, more alive than he ever did among cars and sidewalks. But then, something changed. When the first week turned into 2, his family began to grow uneasy. Normally, he would find a way to check in, sometimes through a nearby town, sometimes by leaving messages with fellow hikers he crossed paths with. But this time, there was silence. His phone was useless in the deep forests, but he had always managed to leave some kind of sign before. Now, there was nothing. His family tried to brush away the fear, reminding themselves of who he was. "He's fine," they told each other. "He's probably just pushing himself harder this time." But as days melted into weeks, the fear became impossible to ignore. They contacted the authorities, and soon search teams were assembled. Helicopters flew over the forests, their blades chopping through the silence of the Ozarks. Trained dogs sniffed for trails, picking up faint scents that disappeared in the dense underbrush. Volunteers combed through trails with flashlights and radios, calling his name into the emptiness. The Ozarks, however, are vast and unforgiving. The terrain is rugged, the caves stretch endlessly underground, and rivers cut through the land like hidden traps. To search here is to search for a needle in a haystack. Alive, the haystack is alive, growing, and shifting every day. They found signs of him at first. A campfire burned down to cold ash. The remains of a spear he had carved from wood. Footprints leading toward a cave system not far from the river. Each discovery gave the family hope. The Ozarks, after all, have their shadows. Remote areas are sometimes used for illegal activity, meth labs, hidden camps, things people don't want outsiders to find. Could he have stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to see? Could someone have made sure he never left the forest again? The family hated these thoughts, but once they were planted, they were impossible to shake. Every year after his disappearance, the pain only deepened. Holidays came and went, and his chair sat empty. His journal, the one he carried on every trip, was never recovered. His knife, his bag, even his clothes, none of it was found. To his family, this absence was worse than a grave. At least a grave would mean closure. But with nothing, they were left trapped in an endless cycle of questions and hope that refused to die. And still, even in the silence, some of them held on to belief. His sister once said, "If anyone could survive out there, it would be him." She pictured him living in the wilderness still, perhaps injured, perhaps lost, but alive, clinging to the skills that had defined him his entire life. She prayed that one day he would walk out of the forest once more, appearing on a trail or by a riverbank, like some ghost made flesh. As the years passed, even her hope began to waver. When the first calls for help went out, the local authorities moved quickly. They knew the Ozarks well, knew its dangers, its rugged paths, and the way it could swallow people whole. But they also knew the man they were searching for wasn't ordinary. He was a survivalist, someone who had trained for years to live in the wild. It made their job both easier and harder. Easier because they knew he could survive longer than most. Harder because he could be anywhere, moving farther than the average lost hiker, leaving behind little more than whispers in the trees. Helicopters were brought in first, their blades cutting through the heavy spring air. From above, the Ozarks stretched endlessly, a sea of green broken only by rocky cliffs and winding rivers. Searchers leaned out, scanning for movement, smoke, or anything out of place. But from that height, the forest looked calm, almost peaceful. No matter how hard they looked, there was no sign of him, just the endless canopy, hiding whatever secrets it held beneath. On the ground, teams of searchers worked tirelessly. Trained dogs sniffed at the earth, sometimes picking up faint trails that gave everyone hope, only for them to vanish into nothing. Volunteers joined in, carrying flashlights, radios, and supplies, determined to find even the smallest clue. They searched caves, crawled through thick brush, and waded into rivers, calling his name again and again. The sound of his name echoed off the cliffs and rolled across valleys, but the only answer was silence. Then came the first piece of evidence. Near a clearing, searchers stumbled upon a campfire. The ash was cold, but it hadn't been long extinguished. Nearby, they found the remains of a handmade spearruff, but sturdy, clearly carved by someone who knew what they were doing. These were his signs, proof that he had been there, living the way he always did. For a moment, hope surged through the search party. If he had built fires and weapons, it meant he had survived at least for some time after he entered the forest. It meant they were close. The trails seemed to grow clearer when they discovered footprints. The prints were deep enough to suggest he was carrying weight, perhaps his pack, and they led toward the entrance of a cave system. Caves in the Ozarks are dangerous and unpredictable, miles of twisting tunnels, longer continue at the same scale. It was a blow to the family so sharp it felt like betrayal. "How do you just stop?" his father demanded in a quiet voice, the kind of voice that carried more anger than shouting ever could. But the reality was cruel. They had no new leads, no fresh evidence, and no way to justify endless manpower in a search that felt endless itself. Still, the family refused to give up. They organized their own searches, smaller but fueled by love and desperation. His sister walked the trails until her feet blistered, her eyes scanning every shadow for movement, every bend for a sign. His mother carried his photograph, showing it to anyone who passed, as if someone might say, "Yes, I saw him. He went that way." But every trip ended the same, with silence, with unanswered questions. And with the heavy weight of the forest pressing down on them, some nights his father returned to the clearing where they had found the fire pit. He would sit there quietly, staring at the ash, touching the rocks as if they still carried his son's warmth. To him it was the closest thing to a grave, the last place they knew for certain he had been alive. Sometimes he whispered into the night, not caring if anyone else could hear, "We're still looking, son. We're not giving up." Over time, rumors spread in the community. Some said they had seen a figure moving deep in the woods, someone thin and wild-eyed, living like an animal. Others whispered that he had found a hidden part of the forest, a place where no one else dared to go, and had chosen to stay there forever. But darker rumors took root too. People spoke about hidden dangers in the Ozarks illegal camps, people with secrets, things you weren't supposed to stumble upon. What if he had found something or someone he wasn't meant to? What if the forest wasn't the only thing responsible for his disappearance? The lack of answers gnawed at everyone. Searchers described it as one of the most haunting cases they had ever worked on. "Usually you find something," one volunteer said. "Piece of clothing, a broken tool, anything." But here, it was like he just dissolved into the woods. Hope became both a blessing and a curse. It kept them moving, kept them searching, but it also kept them chained to uncertainty. Every night they dreamed of him walking out of the woods, thin but smiling, his journal in his hand, his voice calm as ever. And every morning they woke to the same silence, the same absence, the same heavy truth. He was still gone. It was the summer of 2024, 3 long years after he had vanished into the wilderness. By then, his family had learned to live in the uneasy balance between hope and grief. They no longer woke every morning expecting him to walk through the door, but neither could they fully accept that he was gone. Life had moved forward around them, seasons changed, birthdays passed. The world spun on, but for those who loved him. Time felt frozen on the day he disappeared. Then, on what began as an ordinary afternoon, something surfaced that would shatter that fragile balance forever. A lone hiker was moving along a quiet stretch of riverbank deep in the Ozarks. The forest was thick that day, heavy with the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem louder. He was used to seeing turtles theirs low, gentle creatures that basked in the sun or slid silently into the water at the first sign of danger. But this one caught his eye immediately. unlikely way, imaginably on the shell of a turtle, wandering the banks of a river. News of the find spread quickly. For the family, it was like being struck by lightning. His sister wept when she heard the details, torn between hope and horror. Only he would think of something like that, she said. Only he would use whatever he had to send us a message. His mother's hand shook as she held the slip of paper with the numbers, her voice breaking as she whispered, "He was alive, at least for long enough to write this." They didn't know whether to rejoice at the possibility of answers or crumble under the thought of what kind of. Desperation had driven him to carve into the shell of a helpless creature. Search teams were assembled once again, though smaller this time, more cautious but equally determined. They followed the coordinates with heavy hearts, every step echoing with the weight of what they might find. The journey to the spot was brutal, thick brush, tearing at their clothes, the sun beating down, insects swarming. But the numbers didn't lie. After hours of hiking, they reached the clearing. The sight that greeted them was haunting. At first glance, it was just another patch of wilderness trees, circling a small open space, grass grown tall and wild. But as they moved deeper in, signs emerged. Pieces of a tarp, shredded and weather-worn, lay tangled in the undergrowth. Rusted tools peeked out from the dirt, half buried by time, and then, scattered across the ground, were fragments of paper, fragile and crumbling, the last remains of a journal that had once been full of words. Most of it was unreadable, destroyed by rain and years of exposure. But on the last page, faded and smudged, one word could still be made out. A single word that sent chills through everyone who saw it. Help. The clearing fell silent as the weight of it pressed down. This wasn't the sign of a man playing at adventure. This wasn't the confident survivalist who had once laughed at the idea of fear. This was desperation, raw and final. He had tried to reach out, tried to leave a message in the only way he could. And somehow, against all odds, it had survived, etched not into stone or wood, but into the living shell of a turtle that wandered the forest until fate brought it before human eyes. For his family, the discovery reopened every wound. His sister held the scraps of the journal and sobbed, whispering he was so close. He wanted us to find him. His father, who had spent countless nights staring into the woods in silence, finally broke down, his strong shoulders shaking as he muttered, "We should have kept looking there, should have gone farther." There was no comfort to give them, no easy answers. Only questions that cut deeper with every passing thought. Theories spread quickly. Some believed he had been injured, unable to move far, and had turned to the only creature near him as a carrier of hope. Others whispered darker things. What if he had been running from someone? What if the coordinates marked a place of danger? What if someone else had forced that desperate message into the shell of a turtle as a cruel joke? But the carving was too deliberate, too personal. To his family, there was no doubt. It was his hand. It was his plea. In the months that followed, the turtle itself became something of a symbol. Locals spoke of it with a strange reverence, calling it a messenger of the forest. Some said it was fate that the creature had survived long enough to be found, carrying its secret across rivers and valleys until the time was right. Others said it was proof that he had fought to the very end, never giving up, even when the odds were against him. Whatever the truth, the image of that turtle's low, silent, bearing the desperate scratches of a man lost to the wilderness, burned itself into their minds forever. And so, 3 years after he vanished, the mystery deepened instead of ended. The coordinates gave them a place, the clearing gave them fragments, but the man himself remained absent. No remains, no body, no final trace. Just whispers carved into a shell and the haunting word help scrawled onto a page. The Ozarks, as always, kept its secrets close, leaving behind only enough to torment those who searched. For the family, closure was still out of reach. The discovery was both a gift and a curse. It proved he had survived longer than anyone dared hope. It proved he had tried to leave them a message. But it also proved his suffering, his fear, his final desperation. His mother said it best, through tears. For 3 years, I prayed he wasn't alone out there. Now I know he was. And that hurts more than anything. The turtle slipped back into the river soon after it was found, disappearing into the water as if its task had been completed. But its shell carried a story that would never be forgotten, Story of a man who had lived for survival, who vanished into the Ozarks, and who, in his final days, found a way to etch his cry for help into the living world around him. When the numbers from the turtle's shell were finally mapped, they led to a place few had ever stepped into. The Ozarks are vast and unforgiving, full of hidden valleys, caves, and clearings that don't appear on any trail maps. But these numbers pointed with sharp precision to one such spot. So remote that even seasoned hikers admitted they had never heard of it. For his family, the discovery was like a second chance, a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, he had tried to leave them a message all along. The search team that assembled wasn't as large as the one in 2021, but the determination was the same. Helicopters couldn't penetrate the dense canopy overhead, so it came down to boots-on-the-ground rescuers, volunteers, and even a few locals who knew the land better than anyone. Each step they took was heavy with meaning. They weren't just walking into the wilderness. They were walking into the possibility of an answer after 3 years of silence. The trail was brutal. Heat pressed down like a weight, and the undergrowth clawed at their clothes and skin. Every branch seemed to snap louder than usual. Every insect buzzed like an echo in the silence. No one spoke much. The air was too thick with tension, and each person carried the same unspoken thought. What if this was it? What if today was the day they finally uncovered the truth? Hours later, the forest seemed to change. The trees thinned ever so slightly, and the ground opened up into a clearing. It wasn't wide or welcoming, just a patch of open earth surrounded by thick woods. But it matched the coordinates exactly. The moment they stepped into it, everyone felt it. A weight, stillness. It was as if the clearing itself remembered. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just grass, weeds, and scattered leaves. But as the team spread out and began to search, pieces of the past began to surface. Near the edge of the clearing, buried under brush, someone uncovered a fragment of tarp. Its color had faded, and the material had torn into jagged pieces, but there was no mistaking what it had been. A shelter, a desperate attempt to keep out the rain. The sight of it hit the family like a punch in the chest. He had been here, he had tried to survive. Not far from the tarp, half buried in the soil, were tools, rusted now, eaten away by years of exposure, but unmistakably used by human hands. A small hatchet, its blade dull and cracked, a metal pot bent and useless. They were the bones of survival, the relics of someone who had fought hard against the wilderness. Each item spoke louder than words. He hadn't vanished instantly. He had lasted, he had endured, he had made a stand here. But the most haunting discovery came when one of the volunteers spotted something sticking out from under a layer of leaves. At first, it looked like nothing more than scraps of paper, darkened and weak from rain and time. But as they carefully lifted it, their breaths caught. It was a notebook. His notebook. The very journal he had carried with him into the wild. The cover was nearly gone, eaten away by weather. Most of the pages were smeared into unreadable blurs of ink, the words washed away by storms and years. But scattered fragments could still be made out. Lists of plants, drawings of trails, notes about food sources. The final testimony of a man who had tried to document his survival, even as time closed in on him, and then came the last page. It was ruined almost beyond recognition. Ink had bled together, water had warped the paper, and dirt clung stubbornly to the fibers. But in the middle, scratched and shaky but unmistakable, was one word. Just one. Help. The clearing fell into silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The word hung in the air like a ghost, whispering louder than any shout. It was a cry across time, a single word that carried everything: his fear, his pain, his desperation. He had been alive here. He had written that word with his own hand, hoping someone would find it. Fragments, hints, whispers, but not the full story. It was as if the Ozarks had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only echoes. The word help became something larger than just a note in a ruined journal. To the family, it was a reminder of his strength and his will to survive, even to the very end. To others, it was a haunting warning about the dangers of the wilderness, about how easily a life could vanish in its depths. To those who searched, it was a voice that would never leave them, a single word burned into their memory forever. As the sun set over the clearing that first evening, the family sat together, holding the notebook in their hands. The air was heavy, but it was different from before. They had come searching for answers, and instead, they had found a plea cry, frozen in time. It didn't give them closure. It didn't heal their wounds, but it gave them something new, a connection. Proof that he had fought, that he had left something behind, that his story wasn't erased completely. The clearing remained quiet as night fell, the trees casting long shadows over the earth where he had once struggled. The Ozarks had given up just enough to remind them that he was real, his fight was real, his pain was real. And though the notebook was fragile, the words scrawled on its last page would last forever. Help. A single word. A cry that crossed 3 years of silence. A reminder that somewhere in the vastness of the wilderness he had called out, and though no one had heard him then, they heard him now. They would never forget. For his family, the discovery of the clearing and the notebook was like reopening a wound that had never healed. For 3 years they had lived in limbo, trapped between hope and despair, unable to fully grieve because they never truly knew what had happened to him. The word on the final page, smeared but still clear, struck them harder than anything else could have. It was not just evidence, it was his voice reaching across time, reminding them of his struggle, his fight, and his final moments. His sister was the first to break down when she saw the notebook. She held it with trembling hands, her tears falling onto the faded pages. Her voice shook as she whispered, "He survived everything life threw at him, but something out there was stronger. We may never know what it was." Those words echoed through the clearing like a truth too heavy to carry. For her, he had always been the strong one, the brother who could fix anything, endure anything, fight through anything. But now she was forced to face the impossible idea that nature, or fate, or something darker had been stronger than him. Their father stood a few steps away, his hand covering his face as he turned from the others. He had been the quiet strength of the family, the one who had always said, "We'll find him. It's tough. He knows how to survive." But in that moment, his shoulders shook. He couldn't hide the grief anymore. Years of hope, denial, and desperate prayers came crashing down. Seeing the word help was like hearing his son's voice cry out, only to realize it had been lost in the wind, unanswered. For a man who had built his life on protecting his family, the guilt was unbearable. Their mother sat in the clearing, clutching the notebook to her chest. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady, almost too calm, as she said, "We failed him, called for us, and we weren't there." It was the deepest fear any parent could carry, the idea that their child had needed them. He had cried out in desperation, and they had not been there to hold his hand, to save him, to bring him home. For her, it wasn't just about loss. It was about helplessness, about the could touch the depth of their grief. People said words like closure and answers, but the family shook their heads. There was no closure in this. Closure comes when there is understanding, when a story has an ending that makes sense. But this was only pain wrapped in mystery. They knew he had fought, they knew he had suffered, but they did not know why. They did not know what final force had defeated him. That emptiness gnawed at them even more than the grief itself, Sister said at one point. It feels like we only got half his story. He lived, he survived, he called out, but the forest kept the rest for itself, and now we'll never know. Her words summed up what all of them felt. The notebook was proof of his presence, but it was also a cruel reminder of absence. The forest had returned just enough to haunt them, but not enough to free them from questions. Their father, usually a man of few words, spoke late one night as they sat around the kitchen table with the notebook between them. His voice was low and broken. When I read that word, I hear him calling to us, and I can't stop thinking. What if we had just searched a little further? What if we had come one more time? What if we had found him before it was too late? The guilt sat heavy on his shoulders. No one could convince him otherwise. No matter how many times people told him they had done everything they could, he would always carry the weight of those what-ifs. His mother's grief took a different shape. She didn't speak much after the discovery, but at night she would sit alone by the window with the notebook in her lap. Sometimes she would whisper as though speaking to him, telling him she was sorry, telling him she loved him, telling him she wished she could have been there. It was a one-sided conversation with a son who was no longer there to answer, but it brought her a kind of fragile comfort. For the sister, the pain turned into anger at times. Anger at the wilderness, at the caves, at the rivers, at the silence that had swallowed her brother. She would say he deserved better, he fought so hard, and in the end, it wasn't even a fair fight. The forest just took him. Her anger was not loud or violent. It was the quiet, simmering kind. The kind that comes from love so strong it can't accept the cruelty of the loss. Even as they mourned, they clung to the small pieces of him the forest had given back. The notebook became a sacred object, something they guarded closely. The last page, with its blurred ink and haunting plea, was both their greatest sorrow and their greatest treasure. It was proof that he had been alive, that he had fought until the very end, that his story had not disappeared completely. It was also a reminder of their bond, that in his last act, he had still reached outward, still left a message in the hope someone would hear. For his family, life after the discovery did not return to normal. It never could. The clearing, the tarp, the tools, the notebook, these were not answers. They were memories carved into the wilderness, memories that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They didn't get to bury him. They didn't get to know how his story ended, but they carried his fight, his plea, and his love within them. His sister said it best when she stood by the river one evening, staring into the moving water where the turtle had been found. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but her voice was strong when she said, "He's part of this place now. The forest has him. But it can never erase him. We'll carry him with us, always. Every single day." No. And in that quiet truth, the family found the only kind of peace they would ever know. Not closure, not answers, just love that refused to fade, and a promise to never let the world forget his struggle, his strength, and his final word. When the turtle was found with those carved coordinates, people couldn't stop asking questions. Everyone wanted to believe it was a desperate man's last attempt to be found, but the mystery only deepened. The word etched into the notebook, "help," was proof of his suffering. Still, the turtle carried a different kind of weight. How long had the coordinates been there? Who carved them, and why, on a living creature that could move for miles? Theories began spreading, from the heartbreaking to the terrifying. Each one trying to make sense of something that refused to be explained. The first The Ozarks are old land filled with caves that stretch like veins under the mountains, rivers that disappear underground, and forests that swallow sound. Native stories tell of spirits tied to the land, guardians or tricksters that lead people astray. More recent legends speak of strange lights in the woods, figures seen only in shadows, voices calling from nowhere. Those who believed in such things pointed to the word help in the notebook and the carved turtle as signs of something beyond human explanation. They argued that he had etched gotten lost. He had been pulled deeper into something the land itself wanted to keep. For his family, these theories were almost unbearable. His sister clung to the idea that he had been injured and had tried to send a message. It was painful, yes, but at least it meant he was still himself to the end, fighting, thinking, never giving up. She said that turtle is proof he didn't stop trying. Even when he knew time was running out, he didn't give in. Still wanted us to find him. For her, that was both heartbreak and pride. Their father, however, couldn't shake the darker possibilities. He had hunted in those woods for years, and he knew how easy it was to come across things you weren't supposed to see. His voice would grow hard when he said he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have just vanished. Someone didn't want him coming back. He imagined a confrontation in the woods, his son stumbling into a camp, seeing something forbidden. That kind of thought tortured him because it meant his son had just been a victim of nature. He had been a victim of people. And that was a wound far deeper to bear. The supernatural theories were harder to talk about, but impossible to ignore. Strangers online debated whether the turtle itself was a sign, some kind of omen or messenger of the forest. Others speculated that the caves in the Ozarks held things people weren't meant to disturb. The word help could have been his plea not only to his family but to anyone who might understand the forces that trapped him. As wild as those ideas sounded, they spread quickly. The mystery wasn't just about one man anymore. It had become a story people used to explain the unexplainable. Even experts argued. Some said the carving on the turtle could only have lasted a year or two before fading. Others claimed it might have been older, which raised another terrifying possibility that the coordinates had been carved by someone else entirely, long before and only now discovered. If that were true, then whose coordinates were they? Whose message had been carried on the turtle's back for years? And why did they lead to the very clearing where he had been? For the family, none of the theories brought real comfort. Each possibility carried its own nightmare. If he had been injured, they pictured him suffering, waiting, carving with trembling hands, hoping against hope. If he had been silenced by people, then his final moments had been violent, cruel, and hidden. And if it was something supernatural, then the mystery was too big, too unknowable, leaving them with a fear that stretched far beyond their son alone. The sister often returned to the same thought. He was so strong. If he couldn't make it out, then it wasn't just bad luck. Something out there was stronger than him. Her words carried the weight of all the theories at once. Injuries, people, forces of nature, or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it had been stronger. And that was the hardest truth to face. Theories continued to swirl online, debated in forums, whispered in towns near the Ozarks, passed along like folklore. Each new person who heard the story added their own spin, their own fear, their own guess. But the truth remained buried in the wilderness. The turtle carried a message, the notebook carried a plea, but the rest of the story belonged to the forest. And that was the most haunting part of all. The family was left not only with grief, but with 1,000 unanswered questions. No matter which theory they considered, the ending was the same: he was gone, and they would never truly know why. When the turtle was found and the coordinates were traced, the family thought they were finally close to an answer. For 3 years they had lived in limbo, clinging to hope, while also fearing the worst. Finding his belongings, the fragments of his tarp, the notebook with that one smudged word, help, should have been a breakthrough. But instead of bringing peace, it reopened wounds that had never truly healed. The discovery answered one question: he had been there, but it gave birth to 100 more. The silence of the Ozarks grew heavier, as if the forest itself was refusing to let go of its secret. Every time his sister closed her eyes, she pictured him alone in that clearing. She imagined him trying to survive, writing in his notebook, desperate enough to carve a message into the shell of a turtle. The thought made her cry. But what made her cry even harder was the knowledge that no one had reached him in time. I had been out there, waiting, calling for help in the only ways he could, and the world had been too far away to hear. For her, the guilt was unbearable. She said once, "What if I had gone out there one more time? What if I had pushed harder, searched longer?" Questions like those haunted her, not because there were answers, but because there never would be. His parents faced the aftermath differently. His mother often clung to the idea that he might still be out there somehow. Even after the coordinates were discovered, she sometimes found herself looking out the window at night, half expecting him to walk up the driveway, smiling, carrying his backpack as if nothing had happened. She admitted to friends that she sometimes dreamed of him calling her name from the woods, and when she woke up, she would lie in bed with tears streaming down her face. For her, closure was impossible because closure meant admitting he was truly gone. His father, on the other hand, grew quieter. The discovery made him restless, pacing at night, staring at maps of the Ozarks, as if some overlooked detail might reveal the truth. He had been a man of reason, of strong hands and steady words, but the forest had taken something from him too. He would sometimes go sit in the garage where his son's old boots and gear were stored, and just stare at them. A neighbor once said they saw him sitting there for hours, not moving, not speaking, dumped, just looking as though he was waiting for the boots to stand up on their own. The unresolved tension didn't just affect the family, but the community felt it too. Local hikers whispered about the story around campfires. Some swore they had seen strange figures near the cave systems, or heard voices echoing where no one should be. Others said they stayed away from those trails entirely, fearing whatever had swallowed him could swallow them too. The Ozarks became more than a wilderness. It became a place of dread, where people felt eyes on them even when they were alone. Even the search teams carried the weight of it. Men and women who had combed the forest in 2021 admitted they had never been able to shake the case. Some said they dreamed of the caves at night, dark and endless, with echoes of footsteps following them. One rescuer admitted he sometimes wondered if he had walked right past the man without realizing it, if the survivor had been too weak to call out. That thought gnawed at him, the guilt of maybe being close enough to save him, but not knowing. and mysterious as ever, their dense forests hiding secrets that may never be fully revealed. For one man, the wilderness was both a test and a trap. He fought, he survived as long as he could. And he left behind a message that traveled in the most unexpected way, a turtle-esque shell, etched with coordinates, a notebook with a single word that spoke volumes. Help. His story reminds us of the fragile line between courage and danger, between survival and the forces beyond our control. The forest kept its secrets, and perhaps it always will. But for his family, for the rescuers, and for those who dared to search, the echoes of his struggle remain unforgettable. So now we leave you with this question. If you were out there, alone, facing the wilderness, what would you do? Would you survive, or would the forest win? Think about it, Tan. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Before you go, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are countless mysteries, stories of courage, and chilling disappearances waiting to be uncovered. Don't miss a single one, because sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets. Subscribe now and join us as we explore the untold stories of survival, mystery, and the unknown.